Okay, so thank you to all the speakers in this panel for those very rich presentations, which gave us a lot of food for thought and for discussion. I think all the papers we've heard and read attempt to tackle the three issues that Samantha identified in her introduction yesterday. They all discuss democracy and its normative standards. They all analyze the nature of representation and the kind of institutional and social mechanism it relies on. And they all try and consider how international organization could be designed and reformed. So, as a consequence, all of them has to face the same methodological problem, which is how to articulate the empirical and the normative dimension of the issue. But they do so in four very different ways. So the first question, which is directed to all the speakers, is simply this one. What role do you give to the constraint of realism? And what role do you give to the ideality which is associated with democratic standards when you're trying to make a critical assessment of the state of international law and when you're trying to conceive, to design potential reforms? So to put it simply, what is the right way, in your view, to articulate our beliefs on what is, on what could be, and on what should be in democratic international representation? So keeping this very general question in mind, I'll ask a couple of questions for each paper, and I'll try to select issues which I think showcase both the commonalities and the differences between their approaches. And I'll start with the more general account, addressing IOs in general, and then move on to accounts based on a specific case, like the European Union or processes around the Global Compact for Refugees. So to start with the last paper we heard, Samantha and José Luis start with normative political theory, but a non-ideal kind of normative political theory, and more specifically a general account of the conditions for democratic legitimacy, including effective popular control and political equality. And they do so in order to infer then what international democratic representation would look like or requires. And in their views, as we've just heard, it would require IOs to represent not only their member state, but also the peoples of these states, or more precisely, the corresponding publics, which are instituted and reinstituted through each particular relation of representation. So two questions. First, on the who of representation. So in your account, while various publics are instituted as subject of representation by various institutions, it seems, but I'm not sure about this reading the paper, that these publics still somehow correspond or coincide with the different peoples of different national states. So the people from one given state are instituted as publics at different level by a different set of institutions, city, the state, IOs, and so on and so forth. And so if I got this right, and I'm not sure, this is not representation of the states only, but it's still representation of the peoples and the publics, or at least the peoples, which are defined or identified at the national state level. So the first question is it so? Because I wasn't sure. If this were to be your view, I'm not sure how it would fit with your account of representation, which is both institutional and multiple. Because, of course, it's not obvious that the publics which are instituted by non-state institutions, by a city or by a supranational union, somehow align with the people who are defined at the national level. So, does your multiple institutional view of representation invite us to recognize transnational subjects of representation, infranational subjects of representation, for instance, in the case of the EU? And alternatively, if in fact your account does recognize such subjects of representation, including of representation by the international organizations at all these different levels, if we have that great a degree of multiplicity, what are the consequences for political equality? In the sense that, of course, if some citizens are represented by a greater number of public institutions, if some citizens are members of a greater number of publics, which are subject of representation, if some people are represented by more powerful kind of public institutions, instituting them as public than other citizens, this creates serious problems for political equality, which is already the case when, for instance, in one given IO, some citizens are represented not only by their states, but also by some other IO, while it's not the case of other citizens. The second question is about the idea of shared sovereignty, which is in the paper, even if you didn't have time to present it here. So one of the main claims of the paper is that international democratic representation requires sovereignty to be shared among various institutions. And you insist that sovereignty should not be conceived as concentrated, as absolute, as unlimited, but on the contrary, as being dispersed and relative and limited. And I do agree with that, but it does raise the issue, which is not tackled at length in the paper, of how conflicts among competing representative or sovereign powers which are representing the same subject will be dealt with. And this is especially important since you have this systemic ambition for your general model. And of course, the issue already arises in federal states, it already arises at the level of the European Union, but it becomes, I think, much more acute when you recognize such a multiplicity of subjects of representation. This might make it difficult to maintain, and I was not sure if you wanted to maintain it because there's just one sentence in the paper that suggests you might want to. It's not clear to me that you can retain the idea of sovereignty in the sense of supreme political power. And of course, when you have supreme political power, you know in advance how the conflicts might be solved or dealt with. But it's much more complicated if you take seriously the idea of a great multiplicity of competing relative limited powers. And you do make the argument, which is interesting, the Republican kind of argument that great multiplicity of powers is a safeguard against some form of abuse of powers and domination, and I think it's convincing. But at the same time, it does create something which is also very important in the Republican tradition and which you put great weight, which is effective popular control, right? Because if citizens exercise control through a multiplicity of institutions which can contradict each other and create conflicts which are solved in some non-systematic, haphazard way, it's not clear they actually have effective control, I think. Okay. So now, Evelyn in her paper takes methodologically an approach very different, maybe opposite. She proposes to start first from a sober assessment of the margins which we have for reforming IOs in the current political context, and from there to draw out proposals for their improvement. Proposals which she describes as less radical but more realistic, because more likely, in the sense, I think, of more likely to succeed in the near, or to be realized in the near future. And this leads her to reject or not to accept the proposal put forward by Samantha and Jose Luis. So I'll leave it to them maybe to, if she wants to develop her criticism, and Samantha and Jose Luis to respond. I would prefer to ask you about your main proposal, which is not to make IOs more democratic, but to improve the quality of their internal deliberation. So my first question is on deliberation. One of the main reasons why you reject the idea of democratizing international organization, international representation, is that, you underline, there's no global agreement on democracy as a value or on a principle of democratic legitimacy or even on a principle of legitimacy in general. And so you think a much more consensual objective is the bettering, the improvement of deliberation within IOs. And this would be more objective, according to your argument, because you see deliberation as the ultimate meta-function of all international organizations. First argument. And also because, second argument, the concept of deliberation is relatively neutral, and I take this to mean compatible with various views about legitimacy. Okay. But, and this is really the first question, I think deliberation is only a neutral concept as long as it remains indeterminate, as long as we're not sure what it means, except people are talking before making a decision. Because as soon as you try to explain what collective deliberation is and requires, so who participates, whether all participants have an equal say, what role experts have and how they are to be selected, what are the rules of order, how much time is given or weight is given to minority versus majority views, what is an acceptable reason or argument, how civil it needs to be, and more importantly, how the deliberation is actually articulated with the actual decision making. As soon as you ask those questions, to respond, you have to explicit the kind of normative requirements you associate with decision making. So you have to bring in non-consensual political objectives and non-consensual moral values. So you write that some form of deliberation, as you insist, are compatible with functional legitimacy, epistocratic legitimacy, social legitimacy in your terms. But I don't think it's the same form of deliberation in each of those cases. So why would a specified view of deliberation be less disputed than a general idea of legitimacy? And isn't there a risk, if we pretend that it is neutral, that what we're doing, in fact, is introducing some non-consensual political principles without saying that we're doing so? The second question is about the realism of your account. So you advocate designing reforms based first and foremost on a clear-sighted assessment of what's possible right now. But I wonder if there isn't something excessively optimistic in your description of IOs as having a primary meta-function which is deliberative rather than related to negotiations. It's clear that if we try to identify what their meta-function could be, it's about some form of coordination. But if you, in your perspective, from a descriptive point of view, not a normative one, it's not clear to me that it's realistic to describe them today descriptively as being institutions which are first and foremost dedicated to deliberation, which is the argument that makes it potentially a consensual principle for you. And relatedly, I'm very interested by your idea of the room for developing subsidiary consultative bodies, but I was wondering if your description of their impact was not a little bit one-sided, because you identify convincingly several positive impacts they can have, but you don't consider a lot the many ways there can be a misuse or a hijacking of such consultative deliberative body, because we know, especially at a domestic level, many ways to use participatory devices to give an air of legitimacy to decisions which have already been made, to make a mostly bargaining or negotiating process look like it's a deliberation, because there's some deliberation on the consultative side, but not on the decision-making side, and so on and so forth. So how realistic is this account? Okay, so now I'll move to the analysis based on particular IOs. Edouard and Dominique consider the question of democratic representation in the EU from what they self-describe as a pragmatic perspective, reflecting on how to adapt old institutions and ideas to new constraints and new circumstances. And so they take stock of the obstacles to overcoming the state-centered approach to representation, and they try and identify which are the potential avenues for change. And this offers some insight about some of the issues I just discussed, I think. So my first question goes back to the conflicts between different levels of representation. You insist in your first section that the duplication of the state structure, so federated, on the one hand, and the duplication of political citizenship, European national, on the other, raises what you describe as a risk of contradiction. What do we do when there are conflicts between these levels in the absence of either a strict hierarchy between them or some absolute separation of competencies? And the way out you suggest, if I understand you correctly, is the duplication of the public sphere, acknowledging the split between national public spheres and a potentially emerging European public sphere, within which claims are made at the two levels and opinions are formed at the two levels. And I do think we need to, I do agree that we do need to think in terms of differentiated public sphere and to think about their articulation. but I'm not sure how this in and of itself is a response to the contradiction problem you point, the problem of contradiction within representation of a given subject. So in what way does this, in your view, alleviate the problem of conflicting representative voices? The second question is about the last section and the role of participatory mechanisms. You describe the limited ways in which European situations have evolved to respond to some new social demands of better representation. And one of the most promising avenues for change you identify is the use of participatory devices. And I think those have a lot of virtues and promises, but I'm not sure participatory devices, as they have developed in the EU, as you describe them, actually address the problem of representation. To the extent they are strictly consultative, one may hope that they bring more diversity of view and that they help improve the deliberative process, as Evelyn might hope, for instance. But I'm not sure this is really solving the representation issue even partially. And of course, we could have participatory devices which have not strictly, which have some decision-making or some binary constraining power. But then, this would, of course, raise new questions about popular effective control in the case of these bodies, contestability, and so on and so forth. So it would merely shift the question of the background conditions under which democratic representation is possible in the EU. So how do you understand the articulation between consultative participatory bodies, either temporary or permanent, and the representation deficit? And finally, Terry goes yet another way. She starts with a normative account of how participation in democratic processes is a way of solving problems of legitimacy. And then she considers one possible task IOs can accomplish in this direction, taking the Global Compact on Refugees as a case study. And this task is what Terry calls constitutive representation. And this refers to activities through which institutions cultivate the conditions for political agency in what she calls fluid and emergent constituencies, such as the refugees. So 3 such conditions: political recognition, political integration, political commitment. And she analyzes how the UN High Commission for Refugees and the UN General Assembly contribute as orchestrator of this. So my first question is on your normative framework. As you mentioned at the beginning of your talk this morning, your approach is quite different from most of the approach in the other papers, because many papers conceive of democracy as an ideal or a set of normative standards that help define what legitimacy requires. But what you're proposing is to think of democracy as a particular way, as a particular method or instrument to solve legitimacy problems, which can be identified and defined independently from democracy. Those problems having to do with what you call normative conflicts about political rule. So legitimacy is defined independently from democracy. And this, of course, can make perfect sense if one has a descriptive view of legitimacy, right? Because there's a descriptive, you can ask the descriptive questions of how disputes over political authority can be resolved in a stable enough way with solutions which are sufficiently accepted, for instance, or taken as acceptable. But at the same time, you make clear that you see your account of legitimacy as being a normative one, not a descriptive one. And so I'm not sure I grasp what is the normative content of your view of legitimacy. To put it simply, is your idea that legitimacy has normative conditions which can be met either by democratic institutions or maybe by some non-democratic institutions? And in this case, what are those normative requirements which are not necessarily associated with democracy and which define normatively political legitimacy? Second and last question, and I'm being too long for my own good, on constitutive representation. I found your idea that international organizations can contribute in fostering political agencies in emergent groups or communities, very convincing. But I wasn't sure where exactly is located representation in what you describe. Because you use the phrase constitutive representation, but you also describe this work of orchestration by the UNHCR or the UNGA as not being a work of representation. And you underline that those institutions themselves insist they're not representing refugees. So of course I understand that building political agency among refugees will help them engage in representation processes, but it will help them engage as well in other forms of political participation and political action. So it seemed to me, my understanding of the paper was that the end game of your analysis was building a general background political agency in all its forms, with all its potential use, more than representation per se. So, once again, to put it simply, what does representation mean in constitutive representation? Okay. That was a lot of questions, so feel free to respond to all of them, to none of them, to some of them, to mischaracterize my questions. Please ignore the misunderstandings. You can pretend you haven't heard. You can ask questions to the other participants. You can respond for someone else if you think you have a better grasp of his or her paper. Who wants to start?